Can we close that door? A little noisy. Thank you. Well, welcome, everybody. I want to begin by thanking my friend, Chairman Bishop, for working with us under the auspices of the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs to convene a hearing of the reconstitution of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. The U.S. Advisory Commission operated from September 1959 through September 1996. During those 37 years, it was tasked with serving as both a forum for intergovernmental dialogue and a neutral analytical commission that published reports and guidance on how to create partnerships across the different levels of government, much like the Congressional Budget Office, but for intergovernmental relations. The value proposition of functional intergovernmental relations is immense. I know that, having served 14 years in local government. The American federal system demands that these relationships must work. The U.S. Constitution does not give any one level of government absolute power or unlimited jurisdiction over public matters. Therefore, we rely on collaboration across various levels of government to ensure the reliable administration of public services and the protection of the public welfare. A federalism that works and delivers real results for our constituents is as fundamental to our system of governance as our free and fair elections. Without either, confidence in our institutions and working democracy is diminished. The original ACIR comprised 26 members, including executive branch representatives appointed by the President, members of the House and Senate, governors, state legislators, mayors, and county officials. The Commission generally had a staff supporting its work on regulatory issues, taxes, and other related matters. The Commission was defunded in 1996 as part of the push to cut federal agencies. However, in retrospect, the decision to abandon the ACIR might have actually deprived the federal government of useful sources of input and pushback on the encroachment of the federal government into state and local affairs. Without relitigating the rise and fall of the Commission, I believe there is a strong case for reestablishing it. The Commission had a tangible impact on how the federal government interacts with communities around the country. It was a leading voice in identifying the increasing fiscal burdens placed on state and local governments, and as a result, the Commission helped develop the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, PL 104-4, which actually became law. Additionally, I think we would find bipartisan consensus among the membership of this task force on the observation that the intergovernmental partnership is strained. A county in my district recently, for example, hosted a community dialogue on immigration. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, insisted that its contribution to the forum would focus on crimes committed by immigrants. That was not the focus of the local government. When ICE refused to compromise with the county, an ICE representative attended the community meeting uninvited and made her contributions by shouting from the audience, not at the table. I cannot imagine a more appropriate image for the breakdown of intergovernmental collaboration than that of a county government official being forced to gavel down the representative of a federal government agency for being disruptive at what should have been a healing community dialogue. Practically, the task of bringing back the Commission is not a heavy lift. The underlying statute for the Commission is still on the books, and I've previously introduced legislation to restore the Partnership Act, which would largely reinstate the mission, duties, and functions of the original Commission with some minor amendments. Today, we hope to hear recommendations on how we can improve on the original Commission and avoid some of the pitfalls that we experienced during its tenure. For the purpose of today's hearing, we have convened a diverse panel representing a state-level ACIR, former staffers and members of the original ACIR, and leading voices on the issue of federalism in the 21st century. We look forward to recommendations from our witnesses on the value of reconstituting the ACIR and how it can improve in a tangible manner the intergovernmental process. And I particularly want to take note of the presence of Governor Glendenning, former governor of Maryland, a friend, and we're so honored that you volunteered to be here. We didn't even have to ask you, so thank you for joining us here today. And with that, I turn to our chairman of this task force, Congressman Bishop.
All right. Look, it was in 1953, the very beginning of his administration, that Eisenhower had this idea of trying to constitute something to help reestablish the concepts and principles of federalism and make sure that they were very clear in going through. It wasn't until the end of his administration that such an organization took place. In the Resource Committee, in which I chair, we spent a lot of time talking about a memorial to Eisenhower that will be very close to them all, and the proper way of doing it. Perhaps this discussion of constituting, some way of constituting his ideas of how you actually can provide and encourage the concepts of federalism working through would be even a better memorial to Eisenhower than the statute that's being proposed for him. It is one of those things that obviously something went wrong along the way and it has disappeared. We need to rethink how we would constitute that, how we would reorganize it to make sure that it would be meaningful. And I appreciate you guys coming here from distances far away. Some of you had to travel a great deal of distances, and especially with the weather here, it's not been easy. But thank you for your being here. Thank you for talking to us, and thanking you for helping us explore some ideas. In an ideal world, we wouldn't even have to talk about this. Everyone would understand what federalism actually means and how it can benefit all of Americans. We're not in an ideal world, and we have to do something that can give some permanence to helping people remember and reestablish that, and maybe even helping members of Congress realize that even though we want to solve all the problems, there are some problems we shouldn't even attempt to solve in the very first place. Thank you for all being here. Mr. Connolly, thank you for chairing this. I appreciate it very, very much.
I thank my friend, and thank you for letting me chair it. I think we found a more common ground than maybe we suspected as Republicans and Democrats on the whole issue of federalism and what ought to be proper relations among various levels of government. Again, I thank you, my friend, for your leadership and your willingness to.
Perhaps also before we turn to the witnesses.
Of course.
I want to thank Mr. Palmer for being here. He's part of the task force. He's also the chairman, subcommittee chairman on the oversight committee that deals with this particular issue as well. So I appreciate his presence here as well.
And do you have any opening statement, Mr. Palmer?
I do not.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us here today. So let me proceed to. I'm going to introduce all of you and then call on Governor Glendenning first. So let's see. Dr. Cliff Lippert, is the executive director of the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. Dr. John Kincaid is the former executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations and currently the Robert B. and Helen S. Minor Professor of Government and Public Service at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. Dr. Carl Steinberg is a former assistant director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations and is currently the James Holzhauser Jr. Distinguished Professor of Public Administration and Government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Marsha Hale is the former director of the White House Office on Intergovernmental Affairs and currently president of Build America's Future. And then, of course, we have Governor Glendenning. Governor Glendenning is the former governor of Maryland, currently the president of Smart Growth America's Leadership Institute. He's also a prolific writer on the issue of federalism, and we're honored to have him here today. And why don't we start with you, Governor Glendenning?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman. Does that work well? Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind words, and Mr. Chairman and members. I'm very pleased to be here, and especially with my very distinguished colleagues. I want to draw on some comments that I made just recently in a chapter that was in Carl Steinberg's book that was just released, and I have appended that chapter for the record, as well as some other written thoughts as well. And it's clear that most people involved in this discussion understand the rise and the fall of the focus on the intergovernmental relations in our system. And what's especially difficult is the lack of focus on operating as a system. And I've covered that in more detail in my written comments. But when you think about it, it is hard to imagine resolution of the major challenges, conflicts, and crises that are facing this country without a flexible, innovative, and effective intergovernmental system. During my 31 years in elected office, I personally saw the intergovernmental system work, and indeed work very well. I started as a city council member in Hyattsville, a small community of about 18,000, right in the suburbs. And I will tell you, when you're in a region of 5 million people, it is the intergovernmental alliances and relations that you resolve to make things work. For 20 years, I served the leadership of Prince George's County, including 12 years as county executive. I will tell you these personal observations from an intergovernmental perspective are not really just a stroll down memory lane, but they're a framework for understanding why the increasing lack of focus on an intergovernmental system is dangerous and actually produces, I believe, very poor policy outcomes. It was also during this time that I wrote and published a book called Pragmatic Federalism, which emphasized the pragmatic, flexible, innovative nature of the federal system during the 1960s and 1970s. It was used in over 400 colleges and universities, and it was a very optimistic assessment about our future as a federal system. Today, 40 years later, that level of optimism in all candor no longer exists. Instead of being pragmatic, the federal arrangement has become increasingly rigid and inflexible. I can tell you, though, the system can work. I have seen it work both on major projects and on major policies. Just to give you one example of the project, and Congressman, one that you remember well, but it's the reconstruction of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. I-95, 250,000 cars a day, and desperate need of both of rework. During my time as county executive and as governor, we worked with a task force that had 29 federal agencies, 2 states, the District of Columbia, and several local governments. It was also, by the way, very vigorous debate and differences of opinion about cost, design, even about the future of the metropolitan area, because the question became, would we make that bridge metro-ready for the transit to go over it? And even things like bump outs so that pedestrians and bicycles could use the bridge and stop and appreciate their capital. It went through 3 presidents, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. It went through an intergovernmental maze. Jane Plank and Marsha were very much involved in resolving this. And you see what we have today. It worked, and it worked very well. On the programmatic side, just one quick example, and that was the intergovernmental success that resulted from President Clinton's administration proposal to make significant changes to the 6 decades old welfare program. I worked on the welfare reform proposal as governor. We worked with governors, mayors, county executives, and many others, and they're all involved in a very vigorous debate, sometimes even angry. Many meetings were held at the White House with high-level members of the administration. In the end, many people were still unhappy with the legislation. However, I can tell you with certainty that almost all would agree that opportunities were offered for meaningful input and that we did see some modifications in the final program that reflected many of our concerns. Inadequate level of intergovernmental conversation, compromise, and collaboration have been absent from the discussion of many of the key policy issues before us today. Things like tax reform, immigration, infrastructure, environmental rule changing, these are taking place on a very unitary basis with almost no input from the local government. I remind people of the decisions on the air quality regulations. We on the East Coast have a dramatic impact when air emissions are permitted to increase elsewhere. The same in our state, Chesapeake Bay, protecting the Bay. 2 weeks ago, I was on a panel with Republican Governor Bob Ehrlich at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, where we had a discussion somewhat similar to this, and unfortunately, I reached a rather dark conclusion. I said, and I know it's poor form to quote yourself, but it's the fastest way to do it, but I said the absence of an intergovernmental system which would facilitate communication, coordination, and compromise, combined with the extraordinary negatives of current political debate, are bad for policy, bad for our politics, and bad for our country. And that is, for me, a very optimistic person. Let me move to a more optimistic conclusion. In 2013, I was a former president of the Council of State Governments. I was asked to give the keynote, and I called for the creation of an Intergovernmental Relations think tank. There have been many calls since then, and I appreciate the work of the speaker and of this task force about reestablishing some formal manner of intergovernmental relations focusing on the system, including the idea of recreating the ACIR. I do agree with that general conclusion. I would strongly recommend, however, that such an entity should be outside of government itself. It should not even be a quasi-governmental agency. I think it should be a free-standing think tank similar to the Cato Institute or the Brookings Institute, or based at a major university or at a consortium of universities. An alternative location might even be in an existing independent organization like the National Academy of Public Administration example. And I must, in all full disclosure, make it clear that I am an elected fellow of NAPA, and I think Carl is as well, and so we have a little bit of a bias on this. But I would conclude with the observation, we as a nation really have solved bigger problems in the past than are facing us today. We would be best to do so, however, if we remember that we are a federal arrangement and depend on a well-functioning intergovernmental system in order to make this work. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Governor Glendenning. Ms. Hale.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman Bishop, Congressman Connolly, and the other members of the task force. I appreciate the invitation to appear before you today and for the opportunity to discuss the possibility of reconstituting the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. I commend you for your interest in improving the collaboration between all levels of government and hope that today's hearing will provide some insight and information. During my career, I have worked at various levels of government: a city hall, a county planning commission, a governor's Washington, D.C. office, and the U.S. House, Senate, and White House. Presently, I am the president of Building America's Future, a bipartisan, nonprofit national infrastructure coalition founded by Mike Bloomberg, Ed Rendell, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Several years ago, we added Ray LaHood as one of our national co-chairs. Our membership is comprised of state and local elected officials from around the country. We advocate for improving all American infrastructure to enhance our nation's prosperity, economic growth, and international competitiveness. As Assistant to the President and Director of Intergovernmental Affairs at the White House during the Clinton administration, I was a Clinton appointee to ACIR. We found the work of the Commission to be very beneficial. Perhaps the most constructive component was having the ability to hear the views of various appointed and elected officials at all levels of government and for them to hear from each other. To truly understand the impact of actions taken in Washington on states and localities, it was important to engage with elected officials from across the country. And it was also critical that ACIR operate in a bipartisan fashion. I worked closely with several of the members of the Commission, Democrats and Republicans alike, on issues that we all cared about. There are many issues that a reconstituted ACIR could consider. Finding a way to provide a forum for discussing the coordination of federal programs that impact local governments is important. Those appointed should want to work in a bipartisan and collaborative way to solve problems for ACIR to be effective. Too often in this world we live in today, our first instincts are to go to our partisan corners, as our level of government have no permanent established entity for consensus building. Discussion and consensus building amongst Democrats and Republicans at all levels of government might improve our legislative responses. I would like to suggest, if you reconstitute ACIR, that you consider working first on issues where there is common ground between the parties, but also where there is a pressing need to legislate solutions for the future. The rapid advancement of technology is impacting every American. The way technology is changing how we commute, travel, and interact with each other might be an appropriate area to focus on. I urge you to choose a few issues that haven't become partisan to advance some common sense solutions. Look at issues within healthcare, immigration, energy, transportation, or several other areas where new issues have arisen and will need to be dealt with at all levels of government. Many of these issues will require innovative thinking and bipartisan solutions informed by the elected leaders who will need to implement them. As a specific example, we are fast approaching a time when autonomous vehicles will be introduced into our transportation system. What safeguards need to be built into our system? How will Washington legislate? And how will local communities respond? How will autonomous cars integrate into our highways and cities? We undoubtedly will have cars with drivers and autonomous cars sharing our roads and highways. What about the transition period, the next 5 to 10 years? And what is needed beyond that? Reaching out to state and local elected officials and working in collaboration with federal elected and appointed officials through a new ACIR could help move solutions. As states and cities legislate on these issues, greater cooperation and communication with federal officials would be welcome as well. Another issue within the infrastructure arena is the standardization of public-private partnerships. We live in a world of scarce resources. We need to streamline the P3 process to enable the private sector to participate more fully, where appropriate, in building and rebuilding our infrastructure. Not all projects lend themselves to private participation, but where it is appropriate, we should simplify the process. A bipartisan discussion, including all levels of governments and viewpoints, could move this public policy issue along. Again, I congratulate you on your willingness to pursue this issue. I believe the country is looking to elected officials across the country to solve our most pressing issues. Citizens are tired of the endless discussions and arguments. Establishing an entity that allows for greater understanding, collaboration, and definition of the appropriate roles of the various levels of our government could help our discourse. I stand ready to be of assistance and applaud your work.
Thank you so much. Dr. Steinberg. By the way, Dr. Steinberg, I can't help, you are the spitting image of a British actor. I mean, yes. He was in the full Monty, but I won't go there. All right, go ahead.
And it has given me no benefit in terms of extra employment on weekends or, in any event, Tom Wilkinson, yes. Okay. I'm Carl Steinberg, not Tom Wilkinson. And I'm delighted to be here this afternoon, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I offer a pracademic perspective on the subject of restoring the Partnership Act. Prior to my university affiliations, I served for 16 years as an ACIR staff member, as a research analyst, and then assistant director for policy implementation. And then I moved on to become the executive director of the Council of State Governments. Like Governor Glendenning and Professor Kincaid, I'm a fellow in the National Academy Public Administration. I've been there since 1984, the year Congress chartered NAPA. NAPA, I should say, is honored to be among the organizations serving on the advisory council to this task force. And I understand the Academy's president, Teresa Gerton, has communicated with Chairman Bishop regarding some of the recommendations from the Academy that the task force might address in terms of substantive policy areas along the lines that Marsha Hale has mentioned. But my remarks today are my personal views and don't represent the position of the Academy on the proposed legislation. In my judgment, the Restore the Partnership Act is a promising point of departure for rebuilding the federal government's capacity to address current intergovernmental issues and emerging challenges. It's important to recognize as we look at the role of a commission, its structure, and the possible functions and membership, that we recognize that the intergovernmental world has changed dramatically over the past 20 years in a number of ways. Very briefly, so-called wicked problems have emerged, like climate change, the opioid crisis, homelessness, infrastructure, and immigration, What's distinctive about them is that addressing these and other challenges requires not just intergovernmental, but also intersectoral and interdisciplinary approaches. The problems have become more complex, both vertically and horizontally. Secondly, relationships between and among governments, as well as the Big Seven, state and local associations, have become more contentious. Chairman mentioned earlier the bipartisan environment that gave rise to ACIR, beginning with the Eisenhower administration and continuing. And that bipartisan environment has been replaced by one that Professor Kincaid has labeled coercive federalism. Third, it's a more competitive and crowded world in terms of policy analysis and think tanks. ACIR was one of a few organizations that gave attention to intergovernmental relations in its heyday. Now it's been joined by many in this town, most of which have a philosophical, if not a political point of view regarding the policies that they're promoting. So I think in this dramatically changed environment, it's a fair question to ask whether an organization like the proposed National Commission on Intergovernmental Relations could have a positive impact. Would anyone listen to the recommendations that it offered? But it's also important to consider perhaps that this commission is an important first step, but perhaps not the only step that this task force and others could take to establish a better intergovernmental common ground and finding some ways to convene and collaborate on that work. NAPA has, in her letter, suggested some additional steps that this task force might consider. My frame of reference this afternoon for addressing the question of could a National Commission on Intergovernmental Relations be an important addition? The point of reference is a book that Governor Glendenning mentioned, with both he and Professor Kincaid have contributed chapters to. Promising trend noted by the contributors was a resurgence of intergovernmental relations after more than 2 decades of deinstitutionalization. Many initiatives that are on the policy agenda of Congress call for better collaboration, consultation, and coordination with the partners in the federal system, as well as non-governmental entities. With help from Professor Kincaid, my co-editor and I framed a number of big questions in the introduction and invited the contributors to comment on them. And one of the big questions relates to our afternoon's discussion. How important is the absence of institutions that monitor intergovernmental trends and developments, convene meetings, and conduct research to the health of the federal system? Will the need to rebalance the federal government's financial and programmatic roles call for more and sustained attention to intergovernmental management? In response, several of the contributors expressed concern about the unraveling of intergovernmental relations that Governor Glendenning has mentioned, in part due to this void, and recommended that the void be filled. But they expressed concern that federal budget reforms, reorganizations, program eliminations, and domestic legislative initiatives have potentially significant impacts on states and localities which are not appreciated and often not even considered in the policymaking and legislative process. An ACIR-type organization could further understanding of intergovernmental consequences and impacts and improve program design. In conclusion, we summarized the contributors' views as follows. They recognize there's a need for that capacity, but they're skeptical that such an organization similar to the former ACIR could be established in the current political environment. Now, I've reviewed the proposed legislation, and in my statement, I've offered a few technical suggestions that I'd be happy to address in the Q&A time if the members are of interest, but I won't go into them right now. I want to conclude from the standpoint of a former ACIR staff member, 3 of the takeaways from the 37 years of ACIR. There are more than 3, but these are the ones that occurred to me as we're sharing with you this afternoon as you consider moving forward with this legislation. First, it's important to find federal members of the National Commission who are committed to and value intergovernmental consultation and engagement. Professor Kincaid is asked in the book chapter, who are the champions of intergovernmental relations and federalism in the Congress? We're reminded of a time back at the formation of ACIR when champions like Representative L.H. Fountain and Senator Edmund Muskie brought the commission to life and steered it in some positive directions. So the federal representation is key to avoiding the body being considered as just another state and local government interest group. Because if there's lackluster federal participation, it will be viewed that way, and that won't serve its purpose. Second, strong support from the Big Seven is crucial. We're pleased that those organizations are also serving on your advisory council. And finally, a lot of it is about the research agenda, assuming that that will be an important part of the work of a national commission. But the challenge here is to identify research subjects that are timely and relevant, but not too close to the political fray. For the most part, ACR was able to do this pretty well. Some of the examples that Chairman Connolly mentioned in his introductory remarks. But where do you begin finding the common ground that Marsha Hale has talked about in a policy way? And there are places to go. In addition to the National Academy of Public Administration suggestions, the advocacy agendas of the Big Seven organizations provide some clues. There are some common policy areas, one of them being infrastructure and another being workforce development. The third source is U.S. Government Accountability Office reports that have identified program duplication, agency overlap, and high-risk management areas that could also serve as a point of departure at looking at management reforms in the grant and aid area. So in closing, I want to say again that Representative Connolly's Restore the Partnership legislation is an important step, but perhaps not the sole step towards this task force increasing intergovernmental coordination and cooperation. Putting YAR back in intergovernmental relations would send a welcome symbolic and substantive message that there is an important connection between the federal government, the states, local governments, and tribes. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steinberg. Dr. Kincaid.
Thank you, Representative Connolly and Chairman Bishop, for the opportunity to testify for House Bill 534 with some qualifications. I was the executive director of the old ACAR from 1988 to mid-1994, so I speak partly from that experience, and I certainly endorse all of the comments that have made so far on the panel here. I think enacting the Restore the Partnership Act would be an important acknowledgement by Congress of the need to repair our dysfunctional federal system. However, except for the bill's addition of 2 tribal members, which I support, and 1 more state legislator and county officer compared to the old ACIR, the bill virtually duplicates the old ACIR. This is a problem, I think, because the old ACIR was born in 1959 in an era of bipartisanship. It operated most smoothly during that era. So rising political polarization, however, has rocked the old ACIR, and it really finally scuttled it in 1996. And today we're in a period when polarization is at an all-time high. And because virtually all public policy is intergovernmental, I think rebirthing the ACIR with the same mandate was likely to revise polarization on that commission. This, I think, would miss a great opportunity to think innovatively about a new ACIR. Polarization might be mitigated by structuring the membership and/or defining a clearer mission. H.R. 354's appointment process ensures that under unified government, at least 18, possibly 20 of the 30 members will belong to the president's party. If Congress is controlled by the opposite party, at least 16 members will still be of the president's party on a commission for which the bill requires only 13 of 30 members for a quorum. This structure will bypass polarization by allowing party line votes with as few as 13 members. However, I think the legitimacy of the products of such votes would be suspect. A better way, perhaps, to mitigate polarization would be to define a more focused ACIR mission modeled perhaps after the bipartisan CBO. Such a mission could have 5 key components. A new ACIR could, 1, advise the executive and legislative branches on improving the intergovernmental operations and waiver processes of the White House and federal agencies, especially their intergovernmental offices, as well as 2, advise those branches and state, tribal, and local governments of the intergovernmental consequences of U.S. Supreme Court rulings, which really weren't thought of when ACIR was created in 1959. It also could identify, study, and make recommendations on 3, extant regulations found to be intergovernmentally problematic. The federal government's fourth object would be the federal government's 1,216 grants and aid in the system, and fifth, House and/or Senate bills having intergovernmental impacts. The latter, I think, is already implied in Section 6.3 of H.R. 354. A new ACIR could highlight preemptions, waiver potentials, and intergovernmental administrative issues in pending bills. To give the new ACIR more clout, mechanisms, I think, should be created to ensure that ACIR recommendations are officially incorporated into the legislative process, reviewed by relevant White House staff and agency head, and even published in the Federal Register. The size of an ACIR staff and its appropriations will depend on the ACIR's duties. When I left in 1994, ACIR had about 18 full-time employees. I believe the old ACIR's highest appropriation ever was $2.1 million in fiscal 1985, which would be about $4.9 million today. In fiscal 94, the old ACIR had one of the biggest budgets in its history, but that was because, in addition to the appropriation, it had revenues from state contributions and publication sales. This is a question for the new ACIR. I assume the new ACIR would function only on congressional appropriations. That would probably be best, but Congress mandated that the old ACIR turn to state contributions and selling its publications. My written testimony contains more discrete suggestions. Missing from the bill, for instance, is at least one township representative who could be nominated by the National Association of Towns and Townships, a very important general purpose local government. For mayoral appointments, I would suggest dropping the population threshold to at least 100,000, if not 50,000, because only 13% of Americans live in municipalities having 500,000 or more people. So I think H.R. 354 presently is overweighted in favor of the minority of Americans living in big cities. I also would suggest dropping to 1 the number of county representatives from counties having at least 50,000 residents. Appointing 2 from such counties would overrepresent rural counties. Although most Americans live in small and medium-sized communities, they're largely clustered in metropolitan counties. So again, I support a new ACIR. I think more thought could be given to how best to make it truly successful, and some of these ideas have already been presented, and there are more in my written testimony, so I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kincaid and Dr. Lippert.
Thank you. Chairman Bishop, members of the task force, on behalf of my chairman, Senator Mark Norris, my vice chairman, Mayor Larry Waters, and the rest of the task force members, appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I appear to have brought my allergies with me from Tennessee, so I'll try to get through my remarks without collapsing into a heap. As already mentioned, my name is Cliff Lippert, and I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, or thankfully, TASR for short. We're one of the few remaining state ACIRs. So today I'm going to target my brief remarks towards sharing with you some of the characteristics that have contributed to the prolonged success of TASR, in the hopes that some of those lessons may be useful to efforts to reconstitute a national ACIR in some form. I firmly believe that in this time of shifting priorities and expectations among the federal, state, tribal, and local governments and the people that they serve, the reconstitution of some form of an ACIR as a permanent forum for the study and deliberation of intergovernmental issues would make an immeasurable contribution toward better government. First, a little background. TASR was created by the Tennessee General Assembly in 1978 to monitor the operation of federal, state, and local relations in Tennessee and make recommendations for their improvement. Now, I've included information on the composition of our membership in my remarks, but in short, the Commission is a permanent bipartisan body representing the executive and legislative branches of the state, as well as city and county governments and public members. Importantly, our members include 3 statutory members: the Comptroller of the Treasury, the Chairman of our Senate Finance Committee, and the Chairman of our House Finance Committee. Also importantly, the appointment of most of the local government officials rotates among the governor, the lieutenant governor, who's our Speaker of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. The Commission's permanence, its bipartisan makeup, and its broad representation across branches and levels of state government are important strengths of the Commission and have contributed to its successes. The Commission is the only formal venue in the state where all players in the state-local arena can meet in a neutral setting, and the Commission's research process and its quarterly meetings provide a forum for other interests beyond local elected and appointed officials to air their opinions and concerns. So even if their position is not adopted by the Commission, stakeholders generally see value in being able to state their positions to government officials in a public forum. By serving as a neutral forum informed by professional research, the Commission has been able to foster collaboration among state and local officials and has been instrumental in achieving a number of government reforms. In the past year alone, the Commission completed studies requested by the legislature or our members on emergency 911 functionality and funding, state prisoners held in county jails, growth policy, boat titling, and local cooperation when approving payments in lieu of tax agreements. These issue-centered studies are completed along with recurring annual studies on local fiscal capacity to fund education and a comprehensive inventory of the state's infrastructure needs. All this is accomplished with the assistance of a small staff and a modest budget. I've included copies of recaps of our achievements over the past 2 years of the current General Assembly in my attachments. Excuse me. Our work on broadband internet access and adoption provides a good example of the collaborative value provided by the Commission. In preparing our January 2017 report on this topic, we interviewed or heard testimony from a broad range of federal, state, and local officials, as well as from local utility cooperatives, business interests, and community groups. The Commission used this input to prepare a series of recommendations that focused on filling coverage gaps in the manner least costly to taxpayers and without expanding the size of state government. These recommendations were widely adopted by the governor in the Tennessee Broadband Accessibility Act, which passed the General Assembly in 2017. In closing, I'll add that other factors that have contributed to our success include the active participation of our leadership and members and having a steady revenue source. I'll also add that an important limitation of the Commission is that the same structure that supports bipartisan collaboration within and across levels of government also functionally limits the issues it studies to those that are technical and pragmatic. It's unlikely the Commission could reach consensus on issues with strong ideological divides, and even if it did, taking what could appear to be partisan positions would undercut the perceived neutrality of the Commission and reduce its effectiveness. Similarly, because of the Commission's recommendations are compromises, not just partisan compromises, but more importantly, compromises between the state and its local governments, between city and county governments, or between large and small local governments, the changes endorsed by the Commission tend to be incremental rather than sweeping. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're joined by our colleague and friend, Richie Neal from Massachusetts. Thank you. I know you've got a busy schedule today. Thank you for joining us today, Richie. With that, Chairman Bishop, why don't you go first? Oh, all right. Well, thank you all so much. Let me begin by saying I really appreciate your comments, Dr. Kincaid, on the composition. Ours is a draft. I mean, here's where we left off. Let's put it in front of everyone. What do you think? How would we change it? So your comments are absolutely apt. And I hope you'll give us even more detail. And frankly, we're agnostic, I think, about how many members. Now, we're not agnostic about the point you make, Governor Glendenning. There, in my view, as someone who served 14 years in local government in a county that's bigger than 7 states, and I helped run it, I was chairman, and now 10 years up here, you have an all-academic commission, and it will be put right on the shelf and ignored. Make our lives easy, and we'll never deal with it. I'm sorry, I think you used the word pragmatic. You've got to have hands-on politicians who are part of that commission. And I take your point, Dr. Steinberg, that we've got to up that federal participation if it's going to be meaningful. And I give you an opportunity to defend it, but I listened to you carefully and I thought, oh, that would never work. I mean, I can't imagine, frankly, supporting that approach. As somebody who cares a lot about intergovernmental relations, I mean, to make it a think tank or an academic enterprise is the kiss of death in this climate up here. We're actually trying to get our colleagues more interested in the subject matter and take responsibility for it and more engagement. We had a hearing with, was it 3 governors from the West? a really fascinating discussion about some of the challenges they face with respect to the federal government. I, as a local government person, unlike Maryland, you're a home rule state, but Virginia's a Dillon rule state. And a lot of my colleagues didn't even know what a Dillon, I mean, what is that? I'm like, well, you know, the problems aren't only about the federal government, they're often about the state government. And depending on where you are, you know, a thing of terror is for someone to say, let's block grant it and go through the states. Well, where I live, oh my God, we'd rather take our chances with the federal government than Richmond. And so there's a lot of education and so forth. So anyway, I gave that reaction, Governor Glendenning. I certainly want to give you the opportunity to respond.
Congressman, thank you very much. And I'll tell you, some of my colleagues with similar discussion. I look back, and by the way, I appreciate not only your perspectives, but of course, as county executive, Detroit County, there's about 850,000 people around there, and then serving as chairman of the National Governors Association of Council of State Governments, of the elected county executives, and several other organizations. I understand a lot of things that you're talking about. The challenge, I think, is the times. And when I say the times, what tore the commission, original commission apart in many ways was the perception that some of the commission positions were being used in the emerging partisan debate. And I remember specifically some of the intensity over the unfunded mandate issue, and how the perception was that the commission, which was part of the government in many ways, had tilted, and the administration was extraordinarily unhappy with that. And so I would not suggest for a moment that it becomes strictly a academic or a think tank in a way, even though I did use that word in the way you're talking. I think that to have some degree of autonomy, though, where it's perceived of bringing people together with some type of neutrality and respect, so that it is not immediately, because I picture what's going to happen if it is recognized as a government agency right now, is it merely an extension of the White House or extension of Congress, with debates going on on some very crucial issues, or is it going to be a forum where people with different things can really come together, vigorously argue these things out, and have deliberations and come up with some modifications, and working with Congress, working with the White House, be able to suggest things, but not part of that. Is the only distinction I'm trying to make.
And I take your point, but I'll give you an example of, I was in local government when the bill passed, No Child Left Behind. Now, from a local government point of view, I helped run the 10th largest school district in America. And that was an unfunded mandate. It was very rigid in its application. So you could get some small subset of a school fail in one category, and the whole school gets a scarlet letter. Not quite sure what the point of that was or how that helped anybody, but, and what struck me about the legislation on the receiving end was well-intentioned, but whoever wrote it never ran a school district. You know, I mean, the hands-on part was missing, and lots of absolutely noble goals and full of aspirations, but not all that practical. And had there been a sounding board, maybe like the ACIR, maybe we could have avoided some of those pitfalls. I don't know. So it has to be a blend, and I certainly take your point about that. Ms. Hale, you intrigue me in saying start with common ground, and I think that's good advice. I'd put it a little, put some points on the scoreboard before you start mucking around in big polemical kinds of things. And it's interesting to me, why do we need it? Let me give you an example that intrigues me, and I'm not making a normative statement one way or the other, but marijuana. We're now in this odd situation where we have a federal law that says it's the most dangerous drug on the planet. That's how it's classified. But almost half the states in this union have decided otherwise. And some of them are legalizing it entirely for recreational purposes. Some have carve-outs for medical marijuana, and other subsets of the same. Well, how can we have a federal law and half the country is sliding away from it? That's a great example of the breakdown, it seems to me, of this intergovernmental structure, and we have to harmonize that. Are we going to, at the federal level, are we going to continue to just kind of pretend we don't see anything or hear anything? And at the state level, having that federal law unchanged, that posture that it's the most, makes medical protocols difficult, doing research difficult, trying to get to data that one way or the other it is efficacious or dangerous or not, very, very difficult at the statewide level. So to me, that would, I mean, there are a lot of us up here, irrespective of one's philosophical view about it, would agree that this is untenable where we are right now. We have to do something about that. I wonder if you'd comment a little bit about, I mean, would that kind of, and maybe there are some other examples of what would be good categories of that common ground you referred to.
Well, in coming here today, I honestly didn't think about the marijuana issue, but now you bring up a very good point. And perhaps, like the marijuana issue, someone could do a survey of what other issues are out there where there are 10 to 20 states who have done their own legislation that is not either contradictory but not complementary with where federal legislation is. And then you could bring in the mayors and the governors and the state legislators to talk about why that's happening and what possible solutions.
Sure. Yeah. And by the way, we had a hearing this morning on the opioid crisis affecting so many of our communities, and marijuana is not unrelated to that because it can be an alternative, non-addictive alternative for pain management. And again, this conundrum of a federal rule and law versus state rules and laws kind of makes it very difficult to proceed in that regard.
But that would be a very good place to start.
Mr. Bishop?
Okay. Let me ask a couple questions here again. Dr. Lippert, let me start with you because you ran basically what we're talking about there on the statewide level. So just in general, how frequently are the recommendations that your organization makes accepted by local governments?
In most cases, our recommendations are implemented through state law. So it's more that the locals on our commission and who represent broader local governments in the state of Tennessee work through us to reach compromises that they're comfortable with. But then it still has to go to the General Assembly for them to ultimately be adopted. And a fair number of times they are. Often, of course, through the legislative process, they'll be further amended and further changed, and sometimes it's not immediate. We continue to track every year past recommendations we've made to see whether some form of those have come back up, and we attend committee meetings to comment on those when they ask us to. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years, sometimes even longer for the recommendations to be adopted, but often they are in some form or another. I will say also, and I think this is equally useful, a number of times our recommendations are used to defeat alternate recommendations. So in other words, a bill that goes contrary to what the commission has recommended, often contrary to what our local members would like to see. They'll bring up our reports in, they being the General Assembly, will bring up our reports in committee meetings to counter other legislation.
So, quick, how big is the staff you all have?
So our current research staff, full-time research staff, counting myself and our deputy director, is 12, though we are hiring. And then we have a support staff of 4. So we have 16 total full-time staff.
So let me just go one more. Take one instance. You mentioned a couple of you in 9/11 boat, let's say boat titling. Do the boat titling issue. So okay. What do y'all do?
Okay, so on the boat titling, we go through a fairly detailed research process for every project. And I will say boat titling was one of those, I thought, oh, finally, a simple project. No, there's no such thing as a simple intergovernmental project. So what we'll do is it starts with proposed legislation or an idea from one of our commission members. In this case, it was proposed legislation to create a system of boat titling in Tennessee, which currently we have registration but no titling required. So we'll start with the legislation. We'll speak to the sponsor. We'll look at past legislative attempts to do something similar. And then we'll go out and meet with representatives of local governments. In this case, we met with the county clerks as well as local mayors, because the clerks are the ones who implement titling for other vehicles in Tennessee. We'll meet with other state agencies. We do an extensive study of the literature for best practices, but probably most importantly, we look at all 50 states to see what best practices are in other states and how they do the same thing. Then we'll bring that back to our commission, and we'll have panelists from different groups come and speak to them and work our way through to a recommendation.
Who picks the topics that you discuss?
So most of our topics are referred to us by the General Assembly, and we have a protocol where we only guarantee to take a study if it's sent to us by public chapter or requested by both chambers, both the Senate and the House. Because in the past, we've become kind of a summer study dumping ground where just, one subcommittee of one chamber would send us something as a way to save face for a member. Right. So we've tried to reduce the number of studies coming to us to those that they're seriously interested in, that both chambers are seriously interested in doing something on, or a number of our studies come to us from our commission members themselves. Everything is put up to a vote of the commission at our May meeting, our spring meeting, which is after the General Assembly is normally left, and then the commission votes on what issues they're going to pursue that year.
So, Ms. Hale, you also talked about the idea that there needs to be some kind of entity that could determine not necessarily what the issues are, because that's what you're talking about, one of the problems that came with the old commission, but necessarily like who makes the decision, which level of government should be making those decisions. How would you go about picking those topics?
That the commission should take up? Or-
Yeah.
Yeah.
On like which levels they should make a recommendation.
Well, I think you get together a representative group of the federal level. The cabinet officials that were involved in ACIR were very helpful because they were activists, at least while I was there. One was then Secretary of Education Riley. And they brought issues forward. Then Mayor Rendell, Governor Levitt, Victor Ashe, they would all bring forward some ideas, at least to us, maybe John got it in a different way, of the types of issues they would like to look into.
So basically, the organization was self-selecting on where they went,
Well, I think
as opposed to be given assignments from a legislative body.
I may have gotten it at a different access point than you did, but I got a lot over the transom. This is what we'd like to talk about. Unfunded mandates was a huge issue. It was a mammoth issue and very important to then the President of the United States, having been a governor, and many of the mayors and governors that were on the panel, on the commission. So that was something they had no...
Funded mandates ain't that much better. Dr. Steinberg, can I ask you, one of the things you said is who would actually listen. Let's take this issue just like a consultation, for example. The law does require consultation between federal, in many areas, between federal government and local governments or interest groups. But in no way do we actually define what constitutes consultation. How would you handle that kind of a situation?
Well, consultation is defined in many different ways. In terms of legislation, executive orders, the administrative procedures, and the like. And it's not well defined. What do you mean by consultation? And I think what we mean by consultation, as we've talked about this legislation, is it's not a top-down sort of process where the federal government sends out a notice of rulemaking or a meeting of an advisory committee and, okay, we're here to listen to you, and then we're going to go and pretty much do what we wanted to do in the first place. We're talking about finding ways to have genuine intergovernmental consultation where the representatives around the table are listening to one another, are debating with one another, and are showing mutual respect for one another regardless of their politics, regardless of their level of government or their role in that government. I think that's an ideal. That's something ACIR, from time to time, as staff, we felt we were getting there. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not a pretty process. But you can set up a mechanism to engage. For example, the previous question about how do you select a research topic? Well, that's a consultation process. At various times with ACIR, we not just as staff ask the commission members, what are some of your top issues back home that you feel deserve kind of an attention in a body like an ACIR? We would convene sessions, I think we call them thinker sessions, to come in and tell us about not just current issues, but what's coming down the pike that we should be concerned about and alert the members of the intergovernmental community around. And so from time to time, there were legislative directives to conduct a study, or there were requests from the administration to embark on let's say, a grant management simplification project, as was done during the Carter administration. But it's a multifaceted process that we're looking at, not just top-down.
I'm making an assumption that the Tennessee process, you are responsible to report to the General Assembly, state legislature.
That's correct.
The ACIR that we used to have, to whom were they to report? To whom were they responsible?
They were responsible to Congress, and every 5 years were mandated to prepare and submit a report and appear before the oversight subcommittees and committees to talk about the record.
Every 5 years?
Every 5 years.
Yes, but the problem was there was no formal mechanism for getting the attention of Congress. So the recommendation sort of went out there, which is why I was suggesting it would be good to build into the new bills some formal mechanisms to get it into the legislative process, the administrative process, and so on.
Yeah, 5 years is,
Yeah.
you miss an entire administration that way.
Although, if I could pick up on Cliff's point and respond to your question about, well, what's your impact? What have you guys actually done? You've spent a fair amount of time, resources, you've addressed problems. What difference have you made? That's a really tough question to answer, and we would get that from the committees. And we could point to areas, for example, that the commission was involved very much in looking at federal anti-recession fiscal assistance, which led to the passage of the State and Local Fiscal Assistance Act, General Revenue Sharing in 1972. Was ACR responsible? No. It was one of several organizations that kind of moved the ball down the field, if you will. And the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act is another good example where ACR was an important player. It provided kind of the substantive research and analysis around why are unfunded mandates a problem and to what degree and what are some of the options for dealing with them. But others really were very much at the table and moved the ball down the field. So it's really hard to discern that impact.
So you said, like in Tennessee, that the bulk of what you're doing is technical and pragmatic.
I would say so, yes.
If we were to ever reinstitute an ACIR process, would that have to be the process we do on a federal level? Would it be more effective if it was technical and pragmatic in nature as opposed to the ideological approaches?
That's
Dr.
the thrust
Kincaid?
of my recommendation, that, looking very specifically at issues in pending legislation, regulations that are already intergovernmentally problematic. We don't need to take on, the ACR doesn't need to take on the whole marijuana issue, but there's some very important issues within there that I think could be dealt with very pragmatically. And so my view is that would be a good direction, maybe thinking of CBO as kind of a rough model along bipartisan lines.
I've taken too long. You have questions? I don't want to just dominate.
Thank you both, and thanks to the panelists.
Can I interrupt just 1 second, Richie? I mean,
I think you're going to.
You now have sort of 3 different levels of government represented here. Richie was mayor of his city, I was chairman of my county, and you were in the state government, weren't you? Yeah. So we bring a certain perspective to what we're doing. Excuse me.
No, thank you. Thank you. I overwhelmingly, the members of Congress, as you know, they come from state legislatures, which in and of itself starts with a certain bias, I think. And for those of us who came from local government, you're more interested in problem solving. And in my time, which is now a long time in Congress, the other part of it that I have found that's important, there really is terrific information that the Federal Reserve Board puts out. There's terrific information that CBO puts out, Joint Tax puts out. I mean, these are really substantive reports. And I find that there's a greater tendency here all of the time to kind of reject much of the data and information if it doesn't square with the ideological purity that both sides have now become more and more inclined to embrace. And the other phenomena that has occurred during my time, it's the alleged think tanks. And look, we're all grateful for that information, but we have the opportunity to go back to them on both sides and say, well, this is what so-and-so says, and we document it on that basis. But oftentimes you'll see the op-ed pieces, or you'll see the interviews that they do, and you have to concede almost immediately that they begin with a conclusion and then go looking for the documentation. I mean, it's really changed things here substantially. And as one who has an academic background and has an interest in really discerning information, what strikes me about it is they get to present themselves as fellows of these respective think tanks. But they're very good at advertising themselves, by the way. Very clever as to how they get their messaging out. So I have found that there's plenty of reliable information. I'm not so sure it gets rewarded anymore by both sides. And you know, Barney Frank used to have a funny line when he was here. He used to say that anybody who proposed a study had to pass an exam on it in 6 months. and I think that also happened, that there's a tendency for Congress, as you know, to farm out its responsibility for a study. It's just hard to bring it back and then confirm a finding that you don't like. So I think it's invaluable, and I will tell you that I thought that the National League of Cities and Towns during my time as mayor, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, because you have to work together. You just have to. There's no Democratic position, there's no Republican position on those reports that they document. There are urban positions. So I thought they were very, very good to work with over the years. So there is some precedent, I think, for honest advocacy still.
Can I make a quick observation on several of the very insightful comments here? I think there are two things that we're talking about. One is the serious research that goes on and the issues and things like this. And a lot of that, Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely correct, did end up on shelves and all. As a young academician at the time, by the way, I used a lot of the research and data that was gathered by the ACIR in my publications and things like that. I very rarely saw any member of Congress or the White House standing up and say, well, the ACIR has said this tax reform is where we should be headed, but it was excellent research and excellent material. My concern is, and it goes back a little bit to this issue here, of if the Congress is perceived as being very strongly ideologically one way or another, and the White House is, and maybe concurrently all together as a current political situation, then does this just become another ideological expression of the positions? Or, and there's a second rule then beyond the research and all, is this a forum in which you can truly bring together people with different opinions representing different things who will build some bit of a consensus within those groups? Because the issues that we're looking at, they're not going to be resolved unless we can start moving some of the major groups toward a consensus. And I'm looking at some of these issues like the proposals, and I'll put that word in quotation because they're not refined yet, on infrastructure. But there's a great deal of debate going out there in state and local right now, and state and local contrast to national, and some of the other issues. And I thought the comments about marijuana were really appropriate. I've seen, though, other issues come up in which, for example, marriage rights for gay community and things of this type, in which eventually enough states adopt something that starts to change the national policy. And it's something that has to be emerged and come together. So I think there are two rules. One is a very legitimate research rule, but if the research is perceived only as an extension of the political powers are there. And the second rule, though, which I personally consider to be more important, there's no forum now to come together with diverse people, with the governors and Congress and the White House and the county executives and so on, and say, hey, man, we've got to do something. We've got this infrastructure. Our nation is falling apart, and as long as we're locked into an ideological battle, we're not going to be able to do so. And that's what I'm looking for. And the question in part becomes, okay, how do you do that in a believable way? And I understand that, especially given the current political note. Can I add one footnote, by the way? The state ACIR, at one time, more than half, I think almost 65% of the states had little ACRs, they were called, and they served these functions. And they actually met nationally. All the little ACRs would meet in concurrence with the meeting of the ACIR, the U.S. ACIR, and it was actually very productive in terms of bringing ideas back to the states and bringing state ideas up to the national level. And that was a role. If something gets going, I hope it stimulates a similar outburst of models of this type back in those years.
If I could add a footnote to the footnote, the late Richard Cole did a study in 2010 or 2011, I think it was, and of the some 27 state-level ACIRs, by that point, there were only 10 left. I went back and tried to track down those 10 this past week. I found mine, and I found a very active organization in Indiana, and I found some evidence of organizations in 2 other states, and that's all I could find.
Can I just say one other quick thing, is that, just sort of state the obvious, who gets picked for a new ACIR will make all the difference in the world.
Yep.
Who the personalities are, and do they really want to work in a bipartisan fashion? Because, and you, as is outlined, and as it was before, the different organizations pick the people. So I would suggest a strong emphasis on going to those organizations and saying, we really want this to work. We really only want people who want to work on these issues and have some kind of success. And the last thing I would say is every single White House, whether you're Democrat or Republican, becomes extremely Congress-centric. Everything in that building starts to revolve around which phone call comes from which chairman or senator or whatever. So bringing in the state and local community is more important than ever, and it's a gap in our process these days.
Well, I was going to ask you, Dr. Lippert, as a follow-up to one of the questions. Dr. Kincaid warned us that the composition of the commission could disproportionately lead to an ideological or partisan dominance just by virtue of which party controls whatever. How have you avoided that, or have you avoided that in Tennessee?
We have mostly. Of course, we are bipartisan by statute, both in our legislative members and our local members, though in Tennessee that becomes more and more difficult to have members from both aisles as we get a bigger supermajority, have gotten a bigger supermajority over the years. But the other thing that we've done, I think, that's helped prevent any kind of single control of the commission is we rotate the appointment of those local government members. So they rotate between, like I said in my remarks, between the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker of the House. And by rotating those members, you tend to get, if all 3 of those individuals are of the same party, you might still have a tendency towards nominating from one party, but you get different power bases and different positions. You get people from different parts of the state, and I think that's an important thing to bake into the structure, some kind of mechanism to ensure that you're not getting everybody from the same region or from just from large cities or what have you.
You know, I was thinking about your opening statement, Governor Glendenning, when you talked about, unfortunately, the federal government's approach to federalism, you said was rigid and inflexible. And any of us who've run government at any level have certainly experienced that. And I'm thinking the Silver Line here going out to Dulles Airport, I was intimately involved in it. And I can remember we wanted to make an amendment to our NEPA process where we literally were just moving it a few feet from the center line because of land use issues. Everything had already been approved under the NEPA process. And there was a big debate about whether we had to file a brand new NEPA. I think, but nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. There's no endangered species. There's not a single tree that will be involved. We're literally just moving it 3 feet this way instead of that way. And I think we had to do an EIS, or maybe they finally let us do an amendment, but it was a big deal. And it was emblematic of the problem with it. It's going to cost $1 gazillion for us to comply with this, whatever you require of us. And it's going to delay the project further. And it's all, I mean, frankly, this one is pretty clear cut. And so trying to make the government work better for us without, trying to circumvent the intent behind the legislation, I think is a real challenge. But I do think that an ACIR at the federal level could help us identify some of those opportunities. And I know we heard it at our previous hearing from the Western governors. I was amazed at how much common ground we actually had when I listened to them. I mean, there's an ideological, political thing, but a lot of what they were talking about was just hands-on governance and a more pragmatic approach to trying to make government work for everybody.
As we go forward, if I could ask, as we go forward with this, I see the pitfalls of trying to reorganize something. If I'm going to reorganize something that's merely academic, it's merely coming up with advisory opinions for policy issues, we're replicating what the committees already do. But I also see some need in having something that goes beyond specific topics to more structural issue as to who should be making some kind of decision, how should they be interacting with other people. And I would like just one last question for Dr. Kincaid. You mentioned in there that if you're going to have something, it needs to have clout, I think is the word you used. How do you do that so it doesn't face the same process that the old ACIR faced?
I think perhaps if the focus is more clear on the issues that it's addressing, and it's addressing very specific points within policy areas, would be a way to do that, rather than these very broad subjects. Research on very broad topics is probably going to end up being academic and maybe ideologically polarized, but the kind of common ground that I sense you felt with the governors, you probably had a number of issues where you could all kind of agree. That seems to me the type of thing a new ACIR could focus on, and that I think would need to be defined a bit more clearly in a new statute.
It would have to be very tightly, I'm assuming, very tightly tied to the Congress.
Well,
as
not
to
overly.
where it goes and what the areas of responsibility are, as to then to whom you actually communicate those decisions.
But not overly tightly. If the commission is going to consist of prominent elected officials, including governors and so on, they have to have some autonomy. So they're not going to come just for a technical task. So I think there's a fine line to be drawn here. They have to feel they're engaged in something important, and part of that importance would be some kind of process whereby their recommendations are actually going to be paid attention to by someone. And if not, then I think the commission is going to run into difficulties.
There is precedent for that. I mean, I'm on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. GAO reports to us. They have a high-risk report every year, mandated by law, and we're mandated to have a hearing on it. And we know that every time we do that, they're going to remind us how many of their top 50 recommendations we acted on. So it's a scorecard for ourselves as well as for them. And it works pretty well, that particular model. We have relationships with inspectors general who come up with reports and recommendations, and we've got to receive them and act on them. We have jurisdiction over that. So there is some precedent for doing that. I agree with Mr. Bishop. Reporting every 5 years, whether you need it or not going to work. If it ever worked, it won't work in today's day and age. I mean, that's a recipe for no accountability. I can see you smiling, Governor. Dr. Steinberg.
Build on that.
Last comment.
Yes, sir. It's more than just accountability to Congress and perhaps the executive branch. I think there is an accountability to the appointing authority. I mentioned the importance of the Big Seven sending their A team sit on a national commission. And what I don't think has happened very much is a kind of a connection between that representation and the policy processes and agendas of the respective organizations. I think that would be a different type of accountability, but again, from the standpoint of the members of the commission feeling that their time and talents are valued, not just in Washington, but with their appointing authorities. Could be another tweak of the legislation that might be worth considering.
I invite you all to take another look at it and give us your best shot at how we might change it or modify it or start over even, because we want to try to get this right, and we want it to be as a bipartisan endeavor, recognizing that we need that forum you were talking about, that platform for us to have this discussion, this dialogue, and try to protect ourselves from it becoming captive of any particular point of view or ideology. We want it to be, Governor Glendenning's word, pragmatic, practical. So thank you all so much. My friend, Mr. Bishop, thank you so much for allowing us to have this session today. Very thoughtful.
Thank you.
Thank you.